Rain hammered against the windows of Hartwell Manor the night the Duke's carriage was found overturned in a ditch off the Northbrook road. The horses screaming, the driver dead before anyone reached him, and the Duke himself pulled from the wreckage with no pulse at all. For 3 years, Lady Cecilia Ashworth had shared a roof with a man who never once called her by her first name in private, a man who kissed her hand at dinner parties for the benefit of watching eyes, and retreated to his study the moment the doors closed behind the last guest. A man the servants called His Grace with a flinch, because even they had learned that warmth was not a currency he dealt in. So when word came that the Duke of Hartwell was dead, nobody in that house expected his wife to fall to her knees in the corridor and scream his name until her voice broke. Nobody expected it more than the Duke himself, because Edmund Ashworth was not dead. He was lying very still behind a locked door 2 rooms away, listening to his wife's grief tear through the walls of his house like something alive. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the cold, calculating Duke of Hartwell did not know what to do with what he was feeling. If you have ever loved someone quietly, loved them so carefully, so privately, that they never once suspected the depth of it, then you already know exactly where this story is going, and you already know it is going to cost you something before it is done. Welcome. I am so glad you are here tonight. This is the story of Edmund Ashworth, 8th Duke of Hartwell, and his wife Cecilia. It begins on the night he should have died. It ends somewhere neither of them expected, somewhere honest, for the first time in their marriage. And before we go any further into it, if this opening has already found its way under your skin, please take 1 moment right now. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story on this channel. Tap like if you are already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read every single one, and knowing how far these stories travel genuinely means everything to me. Now, back to Hartwell Manor, where a man who is supposed to be dead is about to hear something that will change him forever. The storm had been building over Hartwell since noon. The kind of storm the old groundskeeper, a man named Terence, who had worked the estate for 40 years, liked to call a settling storm. The sort that arrived to remind a great house that it was still, underneath all its marble and gilt, just a building standing in the rain like everything else. Edmund Ashworth had not wanted to travel that night. He had business in London that could not wait. A meeting with his solicitor regarding the renewal of certain leases on the eastern edge of the estate, leases that, if he was honest with himself, he had been putting off dealing with for months, because dealing with them meant dealing with his cousin Richard, and Edmund preferred, when possible, not to deal with Richard at all. He sat in the carriage with his greatcoat buttoned to the throat, his valet Larry across from him with a lap desk balanced on his knees, going over correspondence by the light of a small lamp that swung gently with the motion of the wheels. "The tenant agreements from Lower Brindle," Larry said, holding up a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Whitmore says 3 of the families are behind on rent again. He's recommending notice to quit for the Hendersons. The Hendersons have 6 children and a husband, with a bad leg from the mill accident," Edmund said, without looking up from the window. "Tell Whitmore I want the rent deferred until spring, not the family evicted in the middle of winter." Larry made a note, but Edmund caught the small pause before he did. The kind of pause that meant something was being filed away rather than simply written down. He had noticed, over the past several months, that James Whitmore's recommendations regarding tenant matters had grown steadily harsher and steadily more frequent, and that the numbers in the estate ledgers did not always match the numbers Whitmore reported aloud. He had not yet decided what to do about it. A duke did not accuse his steward of dishonesty without proof, not when that steward had served the family for 15 years and had the trust, genuine trust, of half the household. "Is something troubling you, Your Grace?" Larry asked. "No," Edmund said, which was, in its way, the truest lie he told that night, because everything about the last 6 months had been troubling him, and he had told no one, least of all his wife. He thought of Cecilia then, the way he often did when he was alone and unguarded enough to let himself, which was rarely and always briefly, and always followed by the same firm mental door closing on the thought. She would be at Hartwell now, most likely in the small sitting room she had claimed for herself, shortly after their marriage, the one with the faded yellow wallpaper that Edmund had told the housekeeper years ago to have replaced, and which, mysteriously, never had been. He suspected Cecilia liked it precisely because it was faded, because it was the one room in that enormous house that did not look as though it had been arranged by a decorator with instructions to impress. She would have a book open in her lap, and she would not be reading it. She would be doing what she always did in the evenings when he was away, sitting very straight, very composed, waiting for nothing in particular, because nothing in particular was what their marriage had given her. 3 years they had been married. 3 years of a partnership that had been arranged, negotiated, and signed with the same careful attention to detail as any of his business contracts, because that was, in the end, exactly what it was. The Earl of Brackenfield's eldest daughter, for an alliance that secured the Hartwell estate's northern boundary disputes, once and for all. Cecilia had been 20 when they married. Edmund had been 32, and already, by then, a man who had learned, through losses he did not discuss, that affection was a door through which other people walked in carrying knives. He had been a good husband, by the standards he understood. He had never raised his voice to her, never humiliated her, never strayed, never spoken of her with anything but correctness in public. He had given her everything a duchess was entitled to. Jewels, carriages, an allowance that she rarely spent in full, a household of 40 servants who answered to her as readily as to him. What he had not given her was himself, and he had told himself for 3 years that this was a mercy. That a woman who did not know her husband well enough to be hurt by him could never truly be hurt by him at all. It was, he sometimes suspected in his quieter moments, a very convenient thing to believe. The carriage hit the bend at Northbrook just as the first true crack of thunder split the sky, and Edmund felt the whole frame of the vehicle lurch sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. The wheel. The driver's voice came, distant and strange through the rain, and then there was no more time for words at all. At Hartwell Manor, Cecilia was, as Edmund had imagined, in the yellow sitting room, though the book in her lap had been abandoned an hour ago, in favour of a letter she was writing to her sister Helen. A letter she had started 3 times and crumpled twice, because every version sounded too cheerful, and Cecilia had stopped being able to write cheerful things to Helen without feeling like a liar. Her lady's maid, Lillian, had just brought in fresh candles when they heard it. The sound of horses arriving at speed, far too fast for the hour, far too fast for the storm, and then voices in the courtyard, raised in a way that voices at Hartwell were never raised. Cecilia was on her feet before she had decided to stand. "My lady," Lillian began, but Cecilia was already moving, already at the door, already hearing the words that were coming up the stairs ahead of whoever was carrying them. Accident, the Northbrook road, His Grace. The next 20 minutes existed for Cecilia afterward, only in pieces. The cold of the marble floor in the entrance hall through the thin soles of her slippers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Diane Pratt, gripping her arm with a strength that left marks. The sight of Larry, Edmund's valet, a man she had always thought of as unshakable, being half carried in by 2 footmen, his arm clearly broken, his face a mask of shock, saying, "His Grace, my lady?" His Grace, over and over, as though the words themselves might explain something that could not be explained. And then Edmund, carried in on a makeshift litter made of a door torn from its hinges, his greatcoat soaked through with rain and something darker, his face the colour of the marble beneath her feet, his eyes closed. "He's not." Cecilia heard her own voice very far away. "He's not. Someone fetch Dr. Vale, now." Dr. Terence Vale arrived within the hour, summoned from the village by a rider, sent the moment the carriage's wreckage had been spotted. He was a calm man, the kind of physician who had attended enough deathbeds and enough recoveries to know that the difference between the two was often invisible for the first crucial hours. He worked over Edmund's still form in the master bedroom for nearly 2 hours, while the household held its collective breath in the corridors below, and when he finally emerged, his face told the household everything before his words did. "I am sorry, Doctor," Vale said quietly to Cecilia, who had not moved from outside the door the entire time. His Grace's injuries were severe. The head wound, in particular, there was nothing more to be done. "I am very sorry, Your Grace." Cecilia stared at him. "He's," she said. The word would not come. "He is gone, my lady," Dr. Vale said. Quite peacefully at the end. He would not have suffered. What happened next would be talked about below stairs for years afterward, not maliciously, but with a kind of awed, careful tenderness, the way servants speak of moments they were not meant to witness, but cannot forget. Lady Cecilia Ashworth, who in 3 years of marriage had never once been seen to weep, who was famous among the staff for a composure so complete that some of the younger maids had genuinely wondered if she was capable of feeling anything at all. Lady Cecilia walked past Dr. Vale into the bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed beside her husband's body, and made a sound that Mrs. Pratt would later describe, with tears in her own eyes, as the sound of something breaking that had been holding very still for a very long time. "Edmund," Cecilia said, "just his name, no title." Cecilia had called her husband Edmund perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always in private, always tentatively, like a word in a language she was not certain she was permitted to speak. "Edmund, Edmund, no, 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 please." She took his hand. It was still warm. Of course it was still warm. It had been mere minutes. And she pressed it between both of hers and bent over it. And the sound she made then broke something in every person standing in that corridor. "You weren't supposed to." Her voice cracked entirely. "You were supposed to come home Thursday. You said Thursday. You promised." "I had. I was going to tell you." She stopped, pressed her forehead to his hand. "And what came next?" she said so quietly that only Dr. Vale and Mrs. Pratt, standing nearest the door, ever heard it at all, though both of them would carry it for the rest of their lives, and neither would ever repeat it to another living soul, not even each other, not for years. "I love you," Cecilia whispered, to a man she believed could no longer hear her, in a house where she had never once dared say it aloud while he could. "I love you, you impossible, distant, infuriating man, and you never let me say it, and now I never." And on the other side of the wall, in the small dressing room adjoining the master bedroom, where Dr. Terence Vale had quietly moved him, not 20 minutes before the rest of the household had even known he'd survived the wreckage at all, Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Hartwell, very much alive, with a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a doctor's hand pressed firmly over his own mouth to keep him silent. Heard every word. I have to pause here for just a moment, because if that found its way into your chest the way it found its way into mine while writing it, then you already understand why this story exists. 3 years of loving someone quietly. 3 years of swallowing the words because the silence felt safer than the risk. And then one night, believing it is already too late, saying everything to a man lying 2 rooms away who can hear every word. If this story is doing something to you tonight, if Cecilia's voice is one you recognize, please hit that subscribe button right now, so this channel can keep bringing you stories like this one. Tap like and leave me a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me, if you are comfortable, who this story made you think of. I read every comment, and I would love to say hello to you from wherever you are in the world. Now, to understand how a duke comes to be declared dead while lying alive in the very next room, we have to go back 2 hours to the wreckage on the Northbrook road. Dr. Terence Vale had been the first physician to reach the overturned carriage, having been roused from his bed in the village by a farmer's boy who'd heard the crash from half a mile away. He found the driver dead at once. There was no question there, none at all. But the man pulled from inside the carriage, though battered, bleeding from a deep gash above his temple, and unconscious, was alive. Unconscious but alive, with a pulse doctor. Vale could feel clearly beneath his fingers. It was in the back of the cart, on the slow journey back to Hartwell through the rain, with Edmund Ashworth's blood-streaked, unconscious face, lit only by the lantern swinging from Dr. Vale's hand, that the doctor noticed something that made him go very still. The wound at Edmund's temple was bad. Bad enough to account for the blood, bad enough to account for the unconsciousness, but it was a graze. A deep one, but a graze. 2 inches further left, and Dr. Vale would have had nothing to do but confirm what everyone already assumed. But it had missed. By 2 inches, on a night when the carriage had, according to the few words the surviving stable hand had managed before fainting from his own injuries, lost a wheel that had been sound that very morning. Dr. Vale had been the Hartwell family physician for 11 years. He had treated Edmund's father before him, and his grandfather before that. He knew this family's history, knew, better than almost anyone outside the family itself, that this was not the first time a Duke of Hartwell had died suddenly and inconveniently, and that not every one of those deaths, in Dr. Vale's private and never-spoken opinion, had been entirely natural. He thought of the wheel, he thought of the 2 inches. And by the time the cart reached the gates of Hartwell Manor, Dr. Terence Vale, a man who had spent 40 years believing that medicine was a science of facts, not strategies, had made a decision that he would spend the rest of that night, and many nights afterward, questioning. Edmund regained consciousness in the cart, briefly, confused, in pain, and Dr. Vale, leaning close, spoke to him in a voice pitched only for his patient's ears. "Your Grace, listen to me. I do not believe this was an accident, and I do not believe whoever arranged it will stop if they learn they failed. You are concussed, and you will not be fit to think clearly for some time. But I need you to hear this now, because I may not have another chance to say it before we reach the house. And once we do, every servant in that household will know whether you live or die within the hour." Edmund, through the haze of pain and confusion, managed 3 words. "What do you?" "I am going to tell them you died," Dr. Vale said. "I am going to move you quietly to the dressing room and tell the household and anyone else who asks that the injuries were fatal. You will have 2 days, perhaps 3, before anyone begins to question a quiet, private mourning period for a man who keeps to himself even in life. In that time, whoever did this will believe they succeeded, and they will move. People show you who they are, Your Grace, when they believe there is no one left to see. It was, Dr. Vale would admit much later, a reckless plan, conceived in the back of a cart by a frightened, exhausted man making a decision in minutes that should have taken weeks. But Edmund Ashworth, even with blood running into his eye and his skull throbbing in time with his pulse, understood the doctor's reasoning with a clarity that frightened him. Someone in my own house tried to kill me. And if they believe they succeeded, they will not be careful anymore. Cecilia, Edmund said, and even Dr. Vale in the dim lantern light saw something flicker across the Duke's bloodied face that he had never seen there before. Not fear of the conspiracy, fear of something else entirely. She will grieve, Your Grace, Dr. Vale said gently. I am sorry for that. But grief is honest in a way that nothing else is. And if you are going to learn who in that house truly cares whether you live or die, perhaps it is time you learned it about her, as well as about everyone else. Edmund did not answer, but he did not refuse either. And so it was that an hour later, Dr. Vale stood outside the master bedroom and told a house full of people that the Duke of Hartwell was dead, while on the other side of a thin wall, very much alive, the Duke of Hartwell heard his wife say, I love you for the first time in 3 years of marriage, to a man she believed could no longer hear her at all. He lay there in the dark of the dressing room for a long time after the sounds in the next room finally quieted. After Mrs. Pratt had gently led Cecilia away to rest, after the candles had been allowed to burn low, after the house had settled into the strange hush that follows a death, Edmund Ashworth stared at the ceiling of a room he had not slept in since he was a boy, with a doctor's hand-bound bandage tight around his skull, and felt, for the first time since his own mother had died when he was 11 years old, something hot and uninvited gather behind his eyes. She loves me, he thought. She has been loving me, quietly, the entire time, and I never once gave her a reason to think it was safe to say so. And somewhere out there in his own house was someone who had tried to make that the last thing he ever heard. By morning, word of the Duke's death had reached every corner of the estate, and by midday it had reached London. The knocker on the front door of Hartwell Manor was wrapped in black crepe within hours. A tradition Mrs. Pratt oversaw personally, her own eyes red-rimmed, her voice steady, only through long practice at holding a household together when its mistress could not. Cecilia had not slept. She sat in the small parlour adjoining the master bedroom. She had refused to leave the floor, refused even to go to her own chambers, wrapped in a shawl, staring at nothing, while Lillian hovered nearby with tea that went cold untouched, cup after cup. It was Lillian who saw it first, though she would not understand what she had seen for 2 more days. My lady, Lillian said softly, begging your pardon, but Mr. Whitmore is here. He says he must speak with you about the estate accounts. He says it cannot wait. Cecilia looked up, and for a moment Lillian saw something pass behind her mistress's eyes that was not grief at all. It was something sharper. At a time like this, Cecilia said. He was most insistent, my lady. James Whitmore had served as steward of the Hartwell estate for 15 years, and in all that time, Cecilia had exchanged perhaps 24 words with him directly. Estate matters had always run through Edmund, and Whitmore had never seemed to expect or particularly welcome the Duchess's involvement in them. He was a tall, neat man with prematurely grey hair, and a manner so smooth it had taken Cecilia years to notice that she could never quite remember, afterward, what exactly he had said. He came into the parlour with his hat already removed, his face arranged into an expression of careful sympathy that did not, Cecilia thought distantly, reach his eyes. "Your Grace," he said, and the title landed strangely on Cecilia's ears. A title that until last night had belonged to someone else. Someone who was, apparently, no longer in the room to claim it. "I am devastated, devastated." His Grace was. There are no words. "But I am afraid certain matters of the estate cannot wait even for grief. And as the only person with authority to act in the Duke's absence until the succession is formally settled." "Succession," Cecilia repeated. "Formality, Your Grace, nothing more. But the law, the title requires. There are documents, the Eastern leases, the tenant agreements, several outstanding accounts that require a signature before the quarter closes, and I should hate for the estate to suffer any disruption during what is already such a Mr. Whitmore." Cecilia's voice was quiet, but something in it made the steward stop mid-sentence. "My husband's body is not yet cold. I do not intend to discuss leases." There was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, but Cecilia had spent 3 years learning to read the silences in this house, because silences were often the only honest things anyone offered her. "Of course, Your Grace," Whitmore said smoothly. "Forgive me. Tomorrow, perhaps, or," and here his eyes flicked, very briefly, toward the closed door of the master bedroom, "perhaps I might simply review the papers myself in the study, and bring you only what absolutely requires your signature, to spare you the burden." "That would be acceptable," Cecilia said, and Whitmore bowed and withdrew, and Cecilia sat back against the cushions and found that her hands, which had been still all morning, were now trembling, though she could not have said, in that moment, exactly why. 2 rooms away, behind a door left very slightly ajar at Dr. Vale's careful instruction. "A doctor checking on the body needs to come and go, Your Grace." And a half-open door explains far more than a closed one. Edmund had heard every word. "The Eastern leases," he thought. "The accounts that require a signature before the quarter closes. Whitmore wants documents signed within a day of my death, by a grieving widow who has never once been shown the estate ledgers in 3 years of marriage, and would have no way of knowing what she was signing." It was, Edmund reflected grimly, a remarkably efficient piece of theatre, and it told him something he had suspected for months, but never had proof of, whatever Whitmore had been doing with the estate's money. He had been counting on having far longer than a single grieving night to cover his tracks, and the carriage accident had not been about removing an inconvenient Duke at all. It had been about removing him before he could look too closely at the books. Which means, Edmund thought, lying very still in the dark, Whitmore did not act alone. A steward does not arrange to tamper with a carriage wheel. Someone with access to the stables did that. Someone the grooms would not question. There was only one person in this household whose presence in the stables would raise no eyebrows at all, at any hour, for any reason. His cousin Richard had arrived from London by noon. Richard Ashworth was Edmund's second cousin, a man 8 years his senior, and the nearest male relative in the Hartwell line, after Edmund himself. A fact that Richard had never, in Edmund's experience, managed to entirely set aside, even at family Christmases. He arrived at Hartwell in a hired carriage, his own. Edmund happened to know, was currently with a wheelwright in London, having thrown a wheel of its own 3 weeks prior, a small detail that meant nothing on its own, but which Edmund, lying in the dark cataloguing every fact he could recall about his cousin's recent movements, found himself unable to dismiss. Richard's grief when Cecilia received him in the formal drawing-room, black curtains already drawn, mirrors already covered, Every clock in the house, already stopped at the hour of the Duke's death, as custom demanded, was loud, theatrical, the kind of grief that filled a room and left very little space for anyone else's. "My dear cousin," Richard said, taking both of Cecilia's hands in his own, a familiarity Cecilia did not recall him ever attempting before. "My dear, dear Cecilia, I came the moment I heard. I could not believe it. Edmund, of all men, I would never have thought." "Thank you for coming, Richard," Cecilia said. She extracted her hands as gently as she could. "You must allow me to help in whatever way I can," Richard went on, settling himself into a chair without being invited to sit. Another small thing, but Cecilia noticed it, the way she had begun, in the last day, to notice everything. The funeral arrangements, the notifications to the family, there is also, I'm afraid, the matter of the title. With no children, forgive me, I know this is painful, but it cannot be avoided. The dukedom passes to me. I want you to know, Cecilia, that whatever happens, you will always have a home at Hartwell. I would never dream of putting Edmund's widow out into the cold." "That is very generous of you," Cecilia said, in a voice that Lillian, standing near the door, would later describe to Mrs. Pratt as the politest voice I have ever heard sound like a closed door. "Of course, there will be papers," Richard said. "Formalities. I've already sent word to my own solicitor. He should arrive within the week to begin the transfer proceedings. No need for you to trouble yourself with any of it. Whitmore can guide you through whatever's required of your signature." And there it was again. Whitmore can guide you through whatever requires your signature. Cecilia said nothing for a long moment. Then she rose, smoothing her black skirts, and said, "You are very kind to think of all this so quickly, Richard. Forgive me. I find I am very tired. Lillian will show you to a room if you intend to stay." After he had gone, Cecilia stood alone in the drawing room, in front of the cold, covered mirror, and said very quietly, to no one, to the empty room, to the husband who could no longer hear her, "He's already decided I'm in the way." She did not know that, 2 rooms away, someone did hear her, and that someone had begun, for the first time in 3 years, to look at his wife the way he ought to have been looking at her all along. Not as a piece of an arrangement, but as the sharpest, stadiest person in a house full of people who had already started circling. That evening, the first full evening of mourning, the household settled into the strange, hushed rhythm that grief imposes on a great house. Candles were lit early and burned low. Voices dropped to murmurs. Somewhere below, the kitchen staff prepared a meal that nobody upstairs would eat. Cecilia retreated, finally, to her own bedroom, adjoining Edmund's, connected by a door that, in 3 years of marriage, had been opened perhaps a dozen times, always at Edmund's choosing, never at hers. She sat at her writing desk, lit a single candle, and began, for the 3rd time in 2 days, a letter to her sister Helen. This time she did not crumple it. "Dearest Helen, I do not know how to write this letter, so I am simply going to write it. And you must forgive me if it does not make sense, because nothing has made sense since last night. Edmund is dead. The carriage, there was an accident on the Northbrook road, and he did not survive it. I keep writing that sentence, and it keeps not becoming true. I keep expecting to hear his step in the corridor, the particular way he closes his study door, neither quite gently nor quite firmly, as though he is always slightly distracted by something else when he does it. Helen, I have to tell you something, and I have never told anyone, not even you, and I am only telling you now, because I think if I do not say it to someone, I shall go mad. I loved him. I have loved him for a long time, longer than I think even I realized until last night when it was too late to matter. I never told him. I told myself it was because he would not have wanted to hear it. He was not a man who wanted things like that said to him. He made that very clear in his way from the very first months of our marriage. But I think, if I am honest, the truth is simpler and less flattering to me. I was afraid. I was afraid that if I said it, and he did not say it back, and I knew he would not, because Edmund did not say things like that to anyone, not since his mother died. Mrs. Pratt told me that once. I was afraid that hearing the silence after I said it would be worse than never saying it at all, so I never said it. For 3 years I shared a house, a name, a table, and sometimes a bed with a man I loved, and I never told him, because I was protecting myself from a silence that I have now gotten anyway, except now it is permanent, and now there is no version of the future where he simply, eventually, comes to feel something for me too. There is no future at all. There is only this house, and this black dress, and a letter I am writing to you by candlelight, because I cannot sleep, and I cannot stop thinking that I wasted 3 years being careful with my own heart, as though it were something that could be spent and saved for later. There is no later. Helen, there was never going to be a later. I think that is the thing nobody tells you about being careful. It does not protect you from loss. It only guarantees that when the loss comes, it arrives with everything still unsaid. I do not expect you to have any wisdom for this. I do not think there is any wisdom for this. I only needed to write it down to someone before the house wakes tomorrow, and I have to be the Duchess of Hartwell again. Composed, correct, receiving condolence visits, signing whatever papers Mr. Whitmore decides require my signature. Instead of simply being a woman who has just learned, one day too late, what she should have said 3 years ago. Your loving sister, Cecilia. She sealed it, set it on the desk to be sent in the morning, and blew out the candle, and did not know that the connecting door to Edmund's bedroom, the door that had been opened perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, stood open by exactly 2 inches, on Dr. Vale's careful instruction, and that on the other side of it, in the dark, her husband had been listening to every word of it being written aloud, because Cecilia, exhausted and grieving and entirely unguarded, had murmured the words to herself as she wrote them, the way people sometimes do when they believe themselves entirely alone. Edmund lay in the dark of the dressing room for a long time afterward, his cracked ribs aching with every breath, and thought about 3 years of silences, his own silences, mostly, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable, that he had spent his entire marriage protecting himself from exactly the kind of loss he had just accidentally caused. She thought I would not want to hear it, he thought, and she was right. I would not have known what to do with it. I still do not know what to do with it, and now she believes she will never have the chance to find out. And the only reason I know any of this at all is because I let a doctor convince me to pretend to be dead. For the first time since the wheel of his carriage had given way on the Northbrook road, Edmund Ashworth found himself wishing, fiercely, that Dr. Vale's plan had never been suggested at all, even as he knew, with the same clarity, that without it, he would never have learned any of this, and that whoever had arranged for that wheel to fail was still out there, in his own house, waiting to see what his death would set in motion. He had given himself, by his own reckoning, perhaps 1 more day of being dead. After that, every hour risked becoming a debt he was not certain he could ever repay, while the master of the house lay awake upstairs wrestling with grief he had caused and could not yet undo. The servants' hall at Hartwell was having a rather different sort of evening. And it is worth pausing here, because a great house in mourning is, in its way, 2 houses at once, the hushed, candle-lit world above the stairs, and the considerably louder, considerably more opinionated world below them. "I'll tell you something for nothing," said Shelley, the youngest of the kitchen maids, scrubbing a pot with more vigour than the pot strictly required. "I've worked in this house 2 years, and I never once saw His Grace look at her ladyship the way he looked at the floor of his own study. Not once. And now look, the whole house in black, and her up there crying fit to bring the roof down, and I'm sitting here thinking, did either of them know? Did either of them have any idea, the whole time, that—" "Shelley," said Mrs. Pratt from the head of the table. In the particular tone she used for ending conversation she had decided had gone on long enough. A household in mourning does not gossip about its mistress's marriage. "I weren't gossiping, Mrs. Pratt. I was observing. You were gossiping with extra syllables," Mrs. Pratt said. And there was a ripple of laughter around the table that nobody quite dared let become a full laugh, given the day, but which everyone needed regardless. Karen, one of the senior housemaids, who had been at Hartwell longer than almost anyone except Mrs. Pratt herself, set down her mending. "I'll say this much, and then I'll say no more on it. I dressed her ladyship's hair the morning after their wedding, 3 years ago, and I have never, not once, in 3 years, seen that woman look at anyone the way she looked at that closed, sturdy door. Every single evening, for about 4 seconds, before she remembered herself and went on to the yellow room instead. 4 seconds, every evening, like clockwork. I used to wonder if she even knew she was doing it." "And His Grace?" Shelley asked, despite Mrs. Pratt's look. "His Grace," Karen said, "is a man who has spent so long making sure nobody could hurt him that I doubt he ever noticed. There was someone standing right in front of him who never had the slightest intention of trying." There was a brief, thoughtful silence around the table, the kind of silence that, in a house full of people who see everything and are permitted to say almost none of it, sometimes carries more weight than anything spoken aloud. "Well," Mrs. Pratt said eventually, standing and beginning to clear the cups, in the brisk way that signalled the evening's reflections were now officially concluded. "Whatever was or wasn't between them, it's done now. God rest him, and it's not our place to wonder what might have been. Off to bed, the lot of you. Tomorrow's another long day, morning or no morning, and breakfast doesn't cook itself." What Mrs. Pratt did not say, though she thought it rather firmly to herself as she climbed the back stairs to her own small room that night, was that in 40 years of service she had buried 2 dukes, and she had never once, not for either of them, heard a single soul in this house cry the way Lady Cecilia had cried. And Mrs. Pratt, who had seen a very great many things in this house over the years, found that she was not, in fact, entirely surprised when, 2 mornings later, word came down from above that His Grace was, after all, alive, and that there had been a misunderstanding regarding the extent of his injuries. She received the news in the servants' hall with nothing more than a long, slow exhale and a quiet, "Well, I did wonder," before instructing the staff, with perfect composure, to begin taking down the black crepe. Though several of the younger maids noticed that Mrs. Pratt's eyes were rather suspiciously bright for the rest of that morning, and nobody, out of respect, said a single word about it. By the second day of mourning, the household had settled into its grim routine, and Edmund, against Dr. Vale's strong objections, voiced in a hushed argument, conducted entirely in whispers through the gap in the dressing-room door, had decided he could no longer simply lie still and listen. "You have 2 cracked ribs and a concussion that, by all rights, should have you flat on your back for a fortnight, Doctor," Vale hissed, checking the bandage at Edmund's temple by the light of a single shielded candle. I am aware of my injuries, Doctor. Then act as though you are. I intend to, Edmund said, quietly. Larry can move freely. Nobody questions a grieving valet wandering the house. At odd hours, looking for something to do with his grief. I want him in the estate study tonight, when Whitmore has retired. The ledgers are kept in the second drawer of the desk, locked. But Larry has had the key copied for me before. For entirely innocent reasons, 3 years ago, when I lost my own. And what, precisely, do you imagine you will find? I imagine, Edmund said, that a man who is in a great deal of debt to people who do not forgive debts kindly might find himself very motivated to ensure that the man who is about to discover that debt never gets the chance to discover it. Dr. Vale was quiet for a moment. You suspected Whitmore before the accident. I suspected the numbers didn't add up, Edmund said. I did not suspect, until last night, that the numbers not adding up might be worth killing for. Men do not usually arrange carriage accidents over a few £100 of discrepancy, Doctor. Whatever a Whitmore has done, it is large enough and urgent enough that he could not wait for me to simply find it in my own time. Larry returned just before 2 in the morning, his face pale in the candlelight, carrying a slim, leather-bound ledger that he had not dared remove from the study. He had instead spent 2 hours, by a shuttered lamp, copying figures onto loose sheets of paper with a hand that by the end was shaking. "Your Grace," Larry whispered. I don't fully understand all of it. The entries are coded somehow, but the sums, Your Grace, over the last 8 months, nearly £11,000 has moved out of the estate accounts through payments to a company called Fenwick and Sons, described as drainage works, eastern boundary. I asked Tom, the head groundsman, quietly, very quietly, Your Grace. I told him nothing, and he says there has been no drainage works on the eastern boundary. None. Not this year, not last year. £11,000. Edmund sat with that figure. For a long moment, the candlelight flickering across the columns of figures Larry had copied. Fenwick and Sons, Edmund said slowly. Larry, do you recall, does my cousin Richard have any business interests under that name? Or anything like it? Larry's face, already pale, went a shade paler. Your Grace, I couldn't say, for certain. But I do recall last spring, hearing one of the London footmen mention that Mr. Richard Ashworth had taken rooms above a gaming establishment near St. James's, and that the establishment's proprietor was a Mr. Fenwick. The picture that had been assembling itself in Edmund's mind for the better, part of a day suddenly clicked into a shape that made his stomach turn. Whitmore has been bleeding the estate for Richard's gambling debts. £11,000, disguised as drainage works that never happened. Money that should have gone to tenant repairs, to wages, to the very families Whitmore was so eager to evict for falling behind on rents they could not pay because the estate that owed them protection was, instead, funding my cousin's card tables. And when I started asking questions about the Eastern leases, questions that would have led, eventually, to Fenwick and Sons, both of them needed me gone before I got there. There's more, Your Grace, Larry said quietly. The last entry, 3 days before the accident, a payment recorded the same way. £1,100 to Fenwick and Sons, drainage works. And beneath it, in the margin, not in the same hand, Your Grace, smaller like it was added afterward, just 2 words. Last one. The candle flame wavered between them. He knew, Edmund said quietly. Whitmore knew, 3 days before my carriage went off the Northbrook road, that this was the last payment he could make before I found the books myself. Last one, meaning the last one before everything ends, one way or another. While Larry had been in the study, Another quiet drama had been unfolding in the part of the house Edmund could not see, though, by the strangest of arrangements, he was about to be told about it in considerable detail by the one person in Hartwell who had no idea he was telling it to anyone at all. Cecilia, unable to sleep, had gone walking the long gallery on the second floor in the small hours, a habit from childhood, walking when thinking became too loud to do lying down, and had encountered near the top of the east staircase her husband's valet, looking, she thought, remarkably alert for a man supposedly drowning in grief, and carrying what appeared to be a stack of papers he was trying, rather unsuccessfully, to conceal inside his coat. "Larry," Cecilia said, and the valet very nearly dropped everything. "Your Grace." Forgive me. I couldn't sleep. I was tidying His Grace's correspondence. It seemed the sort of thing that needed doing, and I couldn't bear to simply sit." Cecilia looked at him for a long moment, and Larry, who had served Edmund Ashworth for 11 years, and had developed, in that time, a healthy respect for how much the Ashworth family noticed, without ever appearing to, felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Larry," Cecilia said slowly, "those are estate ledgers. I recognize Mr. Whitmore's binding. He uses the same bookbinder for all of them. I've seen the spines often enough in the study when I've brought Edmund his tea." She paused. "Why are you carrying estate ledgers out of the study at 2 a.m, the night after your master died?" There was a long, long silence. And then, because Larry was a good man and a loyal one, but not, in the end, a particularly accomplished liar, and because some part of him had been desperate for 2 days to tell someone, anyone, what he had been carrying alone, Larry made a decision that he would later describe to Edmund as either the best or the worst he had ever made in his life, and possibly both at once. "Your Grace," Larry said very quietly, "I need you to come with me. And I need you to understand that what I am about to show you may be the most difficult thing you have ever been asked to believe. But I swear to you, on my own life and on His Grace's memory, I am not lying to you. Please, come with me." What happened next? In the small dressing room off the master bedroom, in the hour before dawn, on the second day of Edmund Ashworth's death, was something that none of the 4 people present, Edmund, Cecilia, Dr. Vale, and Larry, would ever fully agree on how to describe afterward. Cecilia led by Larry through the connecting door she had not opened in months, into a room lit by a single shielded candle, saw her husband, pale, bandaged, very much alive, sitting up against the pillows of a narrow servant's bed with an expression on his face that she had genuinely, in 3 years, never once seen there before, and went absolutely, perfectly still. "You're alive," Cecilia said. It was not a question. It was not, in fact, anything Edmund had been prepared for, because he had spent the better part of a day rehearsing. In the careful, contingency planning way, he rehearsed everything. What he might say to his wife when the moment finally came to reveal the truth. He had imagined explanations, justifications, the careful, measured tone he used for delivering difficult news in business. "I must explain the circumstances, and I trust you will understand the necessity." He had not imagined this. He had not imagined the particular, terrible stillness of his wife's face, the way every line of her, which only hours ago, through a wall, he had heard break completely with grief, now seemed to be holding itself together through nothing but sheer will. "Cecilia," Edmund said. "I can explain. You're alive," Cecilia said again, and her voice, when it came this time, was not soft. "You have been alive. For," she turned to Dr. Vale, and something in her face made the elderly physician take an actual step backward. "For how long? Since last night. Since the moment they carried him in." "Your Grace." The circumstances of the accident were highly suspicious, and I made a judgment, in the moment, that I sat by his body, Cecilia said, and now her voice was shaking. Though whether with grief or fury or both, none of them could tell. I sat there for hours. She stopped. Something crossed her face, a memory arriving, visibly, in real time, and Edmund, watching her, understood with sick certainty exactly what memory it was, because he had heard it too, through the wall, every word of it. I love you. I love you, you impossible, distant, infuriating man, and you never let me say it, and now I never. You heard me, Cecilia said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. Didn't you? You were right there. The dressing room was utterly silent. Even Dr. Vale, a man who had attended births and deaths, and every manner of human extremity in between for 40 years, found he had nothing to say. Cecilia, Edmund said again, and his own voice, for the first time in longer than he could remember, did not sound steady either. Yes, I heard you. For a long moment, nobody moved. Outside, somewhere below, a clock that had been stopped at the hour of the Duke's death sat silent in the drawing room, and the real clocks of the house, the ones nobody had thought to stop, in the kitchens, in the servants' hall, ticked on, indifferent, into a morning that was about to become very complicated indeed. And then Cecilia did something that surprised everyone in that room, including, perhaps most of all, herself. She did not cry. She did not run. She stood very straight in her black morning dress and looked at her husband, alive, bandaged, watching her with an expression she had spent 3 years longing to see and had never once been given, and said in a voice of perfect, terrible calm, "Then you know everything I said, and you know I meant it. And you let me believe, for an entire night, that I had lost my only chance to ever say it to a man who could hear me." She drew a breath. Edmund, what, exactly, were you planning to do with that? Edmund had spent 11 years building a reputation as a man who never lost his composure in a negotiation, and in that moment, facing his wife across a narrow servant's bed at 4 a.m, he discovered that every skill he had ever cultivated was entirely useless to him. "Cecilia," he said, "sit down, please. I will tell you everything, all of it, from the beginning, and you may be as angry as you like afterward, and I will not defend myself against a single word of it. But please, sit down first." Something in his voice, not the Duke's voice, not the careful, measured voice he used for tenants and solicitors and dinner guests, but something rawer than that, made Cecilia, after a long moment, sit. Edmund told her everything. The wheel that had failed on a road it had no business failing on, Dr. Vale's 2 inches. The decision made in the back of a cart, in pain and panic, to let the household believe him dead, to see, in the space the lie created, who in his house would show their true face. He told her about Whitmore's visit within hours of the death, about the £11,000, about Fenwick and Sons, about Richard's gambling debts and the rooms above the gaming house in St. James's. He told her, too, about Richard's visit to her. "The dukedom passes to me. You will always have a home at Hartwell," and watched her face as she understood, for the first time, exactly how quickly her cousin-in-law had begun arranging her future without her. And then, because he had promised himself, lying awake in the dark, that if he ever got the chance to say this, he would not let himself flinch from it. He told her about the letter. "Larry wasn't carrying estate ledgers tonight by accident," Edmund said. "He was carrying them because 2 nights ago I asked him to. But Cecilia, before any of this, I heard you through the door, writing to your sister. I heard the letter, all of it." He paused. "I have spent 3 years believing that the kindest thing I could do for you was to ask nothing of you and expect nothing from you beyond what the arrangement required. I told myself that was respect. That was restraint. His voice roughened. It was cowardice, Cecilia. I was so afraid of needing someone again. After my mother, after. He stopped and started again, more simply. I was so afraid of needing you that I made certain I never gave you the chance to need me either. And you spent 3 years loving me quietly enough that I never even noticed I was breaking your heart by doing it. Cecilia was very still for a long moment. You let me grieve you, she said finally, for an entire night, knowing what it would do to me, because you'd heard, weeks and months of it, all the things I never said, all in one terrible night. And you let me sit there and say goodbye to a man who was lying 2 rooms away, listening to every word. Yes, Edmund said, and you're telling me this now. Not because you decided, lying there, that it was wrong, but because Larry got caught and you didn't have a choice anymore. It landed exactly as hard as Edmund had known it would, because it was exactly true and he did not insult her by pretending otherwise. Yes, he said again, that's also true. Cecilia stood. She walked to the small, high window of the dressing room, where the first grey edge of dawn was beginning to show, and stood with her back to all of them for a long moment. There is something you should know too, she said finally, without turning around. Something I have not told anyone in this house. And given everything you have just told me about Mr. Whitmore, I think it may matter rather more than either of us realized. My sister Helen, Cecilia said, still facing the window, is 22, and 3 years ago, against the advice of every member of our family, she married a man named Jeff Carrow, a man our father considered beneath her, a man with no fortune and, as it turned out, very expensive tastes and very poor judgment at cards. She turned finally to face the room. For the last year, Jeff has owed money, a great deal of money, to a gaming house in London. I did not know at first exactly which one. I only knew that Helen wrote to me 8 months ago, in a state of such terror that I barely recognized her handwriting, because men had come to their lodgings, not asking politely, Edmund, threatening, and Jeff had vanished for 3 days rather than face them, and left Helen alone to answer the door. Edmund felt something cold settle in his chest, because he could already see, with the same dreadful clarity that had told him about Whitmore and Fenwick and Richard, exactly where this was going. I had money of my own, Cecilia continued. The allowance you gave me, I told you once, years ago, that I rarely spent it, and that was true, because I had been quietly sending most of it to Helen for months, to keep those men from her door. But 8 months ago, the amount they demanded was more than my allowance could cover in any reasonable time, and I was desperate, and— She drew a breath, and a man came to me. Here, at Hartwell, he approached me very quietly, very discreetly while you were in London, and told me that he understood my sister's difficulty and that he could arrange for the debt to be managed. Quietly, in installments, if I could simply provide him, from time to time, with certain information. What sort of information? Edmund said. His voice was very level now, the careful, dangerous level of a man holding himself in check. Your schedule, Cecilia said, where you would be, and when. He said it was for. He said there were people interested in your business dealings, rival interests, and that knowing your movements in advance would help them negotiate more favourably. That it would never come to anything that could hurt you. Only ever business, only ever. She closed her eyes. I know how that sounds, Edmund. I have known for months how that sounds. I told myself it could not possibly be as serious as it sounded, because the alternative was that I was the reason something terrible might happen to you, and I could not. I would rather have believed almost anything else. This man, Edmund said. Did he give a name? He never gave one directly. But I saw him once, by accident, in the east corridor near the estate study, in conversation with. Cecilia's voice dropped. With Mr. Whitmore. I assumed at the time that he must simply be a business associate of Whitmore's. I did not think. Edmund, I swear to you, I did not think. The schedule for Wednesday, Edmund said slowly. The trip to London, did you provide it? Cecilia's face had gone the colour of ash. 3 days ago. He came to me 3 days ago. The same day, I now realise, as she could not finish. As the last one, Edmund said quietly. Larry, the ledger entry. Last one. It wasn't only about the money running out, was it? It was the last piece of information they needed. My route, my timing. He looked at Cecilia, and whatever fury had been building in his voice when he asked about the man's name was gone now, replaced by something far more complicated. Cecilia. You gave them nothing they could not have learned from a dozen other sources. My movements were hardly secret, but I imagine, to a man desperate to believe his sister-in-law's silence was bought and paid for, and therefore guaranteed. Your cooperation would have felt like the final, comfortable confirmation that nobody in this house would ever look at him too closely. You weren't the weapon, Cecilia. You were the alibi. That doesn't make it better, Cecilia said, and her voice shook. I knew something was wrong. I felt it every time I handed over that information. I felt it like a stone in my chest. And I told myself it was nothing, because telling myself otherwise meant admitting that I had put your life in danger to protect my sister, and I could not. I did not know how to live with that, Edmund, so I simply didn't. You were protecting Helen from men who would have hurt her, Edmund said. That is not betrayal, Cecilia. That is what love does when it is frightened and has no good choices left. I know, because I have spent the last day learning rather a lot about what fear does to people who love each other and never say so. He held her gaze. The only person in this house who has been unforgivable is the man who used both our fears against us and made certain neither of us ever had reason to compare notes. Dr. Vale, who had been silent for a long time, cleared his throat. Your Grace, he said, forgive me. But if Whitmore's contact knows that Lady Cecilia provided the Wednesday schedule, and if the attempt on your life has now, presumably, been reported back as successful, then whoever this man is will assume the matter is closed, including, I should think, whatever arrangement existed regarding her sister's debt. The implication settled over the room like a physical weight. They have no further use for Helen's silence, Cecilia whispered, or for mine, Edmund, if they think you're dead, and the information served its purpose. What happens to people who are no longer useful, to men like that? Nobody answered her, because nobody needed to. Edmund was out of the narrow servant's bed before Dr. Vale could so much as protest, swaying for a moment with the sudden movement before steadying himself against the wall. His bandaged head throbbing, 2 cracked ribs screaming with every breath, and looked at his wife with an expression that, for the first time in 3 years, held nothing held back at all. Then we have considerably less time than I thought, Edmund said. Cecilia, where exactly does your sister live in London? And how quickly can a rider reach her? The rider, Tom, the head groundsman, the same man who had confirmed for Larry that no drainage works had ever taken place on the eastern boundary, left Hartwell before the household was properly awake, carrying a letter in Cecilia's own hand, addressed to Helen, and a second, sealed letter addressed to no one, which Tom had been instructed to deliver only if the first letter could not be delivered at all. To a Bow Street magistrate named Mr. Edward Pierce, a man Dr. Vale had known for years and trusted absolutely. It was the wrong order of urgency, though none of them could have known it at the time, because the men who had been watching Helen Carrow's lodgings, quietly, patiently, for months, the same men who had once frightened her into silence over Jeff's debts, had received word the previous evening, through channels far faster than a single rider on a tired horse, that the Duke of Hartwell was dead, and a man named James Whitmore, sitting in the estate study at Hartwell, that same morning, with the household still draped in black, had received a letter of his own, delivered by a boy who had ridden through the night from London, and who had been told to put it directly into Whitmore's hand and no one else's. Whitmore read it once, standing at the study window, his face giving away nothing to the footman who had brought it in. Then he folded it carefully, set it in the grate, and watched it burn. The letter had said only this: "It is done on this end. The girl in Camden has served her purpose and is now a liability, given everything that has happened. See to it." Tom had been groundsman at Hartwell for 19 years, and in all that time, he had never once been asked to do anything more demanding than keep the eastern hedgerows in order and the drainage ditches. The real ones, not Mr. Whitmore's imaginary ones, clear before the autumn rains. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of physical work, and had not ridden harder than a gentle trot in perhaps a decade. He left Hartwell while the sky was still the deep blue-black of true night, on the fastest of the estate's horses, with 2 letters sewn into the lining of his coat. Cecilia had insisted on that herself, with her own needle, her hands shaking only slightly, while Tom stood patiently in the kitchen doorway at 4 in the morning, trying not to think too hard about the fact that a duchess was personally stitching emergency correspondence into his coat. "The first letter is for my sister," Cecilia had told him. "Helen Carrow, Camden. The address is on the outside. You must commit it to memory in case the paper is lost. Repeat it back to me." Tom had repeated it. "The second letter is for a Mr. Edward Pierce, at Bow Street, only if you cannot reach Helen in time, or if anything seems wrong when you arrive. Anything at all, Tom. Trust your instincts. And if both seem wrong, my lady." Cecilia had looked at him for a long moment. "Then trust your instincts twice as hard, and find the nearest constable, and tell him the Duchess of Hartwell sent you, and that lives are at stake. Don't wait for permission, Tom. Not tonight." The first 10 miles passed easily enough. Familiar roads, a horse that knew them as well as Tom did, the rhythm of hooves on packed earth, a steady, almost meditative thing in the pre-dawn, quiet. It was somewhere around the 15th mile, as the sky began to lighten into the grey of early morning, that Tom's horse threw a shoe. He felt it before he heard it. A hitch in the gate, wrong, immediately wrong, and pulled up at a crossroads with a sinking feeling that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. There was a smithy in the village, half a mile ahead. He could see the smoke already rising from the forge. Even at this hour, blacksmiths kept early hours. But half a mile there, time for a new shoe, half a mile back to the road. Tom did the arithmetic in his head and did not like the answer. He thought of Cecilia's face in the kitchen doorway. Anything at all, Tom. Trust your instincts. Don't wait for permission. The smithy, when he reached it, was run by a man named Albert who Tom had never met in his life, and who looked, understandably, somewhat alarmed at being roused before sunrise by a wild-eyed groundsman demanding the fastest possible rescheduling of a lathered horse and offering, in payment, considerably more money than the job was worth, along with a story about a duke, a duchess, a conspiracy, and a young woman in Camden whose life might depend on the next 20 minutes. To his eternal credit, Albert the blacksmith, who would, for the rest of his life, Tell this story to anyone who would listen, embellishing it slightly more with each retelling. Did not ask a single further question. He simply set to work with the speed of a man who had decided, on instinct, that the wild-eyed groundsman was telling the truth, and that 20 minutes one way or the other might genuinely matter. 18 minutes later, Tom was back on the road, on a horse with a new shoe and considerably more confidence in its rider's sincerity. And the 18 minutes lost to the smithy turned out, in the end, to matter rather less than Tom feared, and rather more than anyone at Hartwell ever fully appreciated. Because 18 minutes was almost exactly the difference between Tom reaching Camden with a comfortable margin and Tom reaching Camden with no margin at all. He arrived, lathered and exhausted himself by now, at the lodging house in Camden, just as the street was waking up. Costermongers setting up barrows, a milk cart rattling over the cobbles, ordinary London morning sounds that felt, to Tom, almost obscenely calm, given everything he was carrying. He delivered Cecilia's letter into Helen's own hands. A young woman who, Tom thought, looked rather more like her sister than he had expected, the same dark, steady eyes, though paler and thinner and clearly exhausted by months of fear that Tom now understood the whole of for the first time, reading it in her face as she read the letter. Helen read it twice. Then she looked up at Tom and said, in a voice that shook only slightly, "There's a man across the street. He's been there since yesterday evening. I thought I was imagining it. I've thought I was imagining things for months, but..." Tom looked. There was, indeed, a man across the street, leaning against a lamppost, with the particular studied casualness of someone trying very hard to look as though he were doing nothing at all. "Right," Tom said, with the calm of a man who had, in the last 6 hours, ridden through the night, lost a horseshoe, bullied a blacksmith, and arrived at the actual point of his entire desperate errand only to find it was not yet over. "Second letter, then. Is there a constable nearby? Miss? Quickly, if you don't mind. I think we'd best not wait for permission." While all of this was happening, Richard Ashworth, who had spent the morning making quiet, satisfied arrangements with his own solicitor regarding the transfer of the title, and who had not yet learned that anything at all was amiss, made the single mistake that would, by the end of that day, unravel everything he and Whitmore had spent months building. He came to find Cecilia in the small yellow sitting room, the same room she had been in 2 days ago, before the world changed, carrying a thin sheaf of papers and an expression of carefully rehearsed gentleness. "Cecilia," he said, "I know this is difficult, but Whitmore has prepared the documents transferring authority over the estate accounts. A temporary measure, purely, until the formal section is settled, but the bank requires a signature from the current Duchess to release the steward's authority to act. And, well, I thought it might be easier for both of us if I simply brought them to you myself, rather than have Whitmore intrude on you again so soon." He set the papers on the small table between them and produced a pen and smiled. The warm, patient smile of a man comforting a grieving widow, the smile he had clearly practiced. "It's only a formality, my dear. You needn't even read it all, if it's too much. Just here, at the bottom." Cecilia looked at the papers. She looked at Richard's smile. And she thought about £11,000 disguised as drainage works that never happened, and a man named Fenwick above a gaming house in St. James's, and a last one written in the margin of a ledger 3 days before a carriage wheel failed on a road it had no business failing on. She thought, too, about a man 2 rooms away who had spent the entire previous night, against his doctor's express orders, sitting up in a narrow bed, working out exactly how a steward, a cousin, and £11,000 fit together, and who had asked her, before she came down here, to do exactly one thing. Stall him, Cecilia, just for an hour. I need an hour. Of course, Richard, Cecilia said, and picked up the pen. And then paused, looking at the document with an expression of such convincing, fragile confusion that Richard leaned forward, slightly, eager, encouraging. I'm so sorry, Cecilia said. I find I cannot see the words properly. Everything is blurring. I haven't slept, and I am so afraid of signing something I cannot read clearly. In case I make some terrible mistake, with Edmund not even. Her voice caught perfectly on the word Edmund, and Richard's expression softened with exactly the impatient sympathy of a man who believes he is dealing with a fragile, foolish woman and is being remarkably patient about it. Of course, Richard said. Shall I read it to you then? It really is very simple. Would you? Cecilia said. Thank you, Richard. You've been so kind. And Richard Ashworth, who had spent 8 years resenting his younger cousin for inheriting a title Richard believed should rightfully have come to him, and who had spent the last 6 months helping to arrange that cousin's death, sat down across from the cousin's widow and began, slowly and patiently, to read aloud, word for word, a legal document transferring control of the Hartwell estate accounts into hands that were not his own. It took him exactly 40 minutes. It was, by some margin, the longest 40 minutes of his life, though he would not understand why until the study door opened. The estate study, 1 floor below, had been quiet all morning. James Whitmore had spent it efficiently, burning one letter, drafting another, and beginning the careful, unhurried process of moving certain ledgers from his desk into a strong box that, within the week, he intended to have transported to London entirely. He did not hear the door behind him open. He did not hear footsteps, because the man crossing the study floor toward him moved, despite 2 cracked ribs and a bandaged skull, with the silent, deliberate care of someone who had spent years learning that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation is the one before the other party knows it has begun. Good morning, Whitmore, Edmund said. James Whitmore turned around, and for one full second, a second that Larry, watching from the doorway, would describe afterward as the longest second I have ever witnessed in my life. His face did something Edmund had never seen it do in 15 years of dealings. It went, simply and completely, blank, not shocked, not afraid. Blank, the particular blankness of a man whose entire carefully constructed world has just, in an instant, ceased to exist, and who has not yet caught up to the fact. Your Grace, Whitmore said. You'll forgive my appearance, Edmund said, settling himself, with visible effort, into the chair across from his own desk. His desk, which Whitmore had been occupying for 2 days, as though it already belonged to him. I'm told I died on Tuesday. It's been a trying week. Your Grace, I don't. Whitmore's eyes flicked once toward the strong box on the floor beside the desk, and then away, too quickly. £11,000, Edmund said. Fenwick and Sons. Drainage works on the eastern boundary that, as it happens, my groundsman assures me have never taken place. I imagine, if I had the patience to go through every entry in that ledger, and Whitmore, I assure you, I now have a very great deal of patience, I would find a remarkably consistent pattern going back, 8 months, coinciding, I believe, with the period during which my cousin Richard took up residence above a gaming house belonging to a Mr. Fenwick near St. James's. Whitmore said nothing. His hand, Edmund noticed, had drifted very slightly toward the top drawer of the desk, the drawer where Edmund happened to know a steward might reasonably be expected to keep a pistol for the protection of a remote country house. "I would not," Edmund said, very quietly, and something in his voice made Whitmore's hand stop, entirely still, an inch from the drawer. "There are 6 men from the village currently in my stable yard, Whitmore, sent for by Dr. Vale before dawn this morning, and a magistrate from Bow Street who, I am reliably informed, has spent the last several months developing rather strong personal interest in irregularities at certain London gaming establishments, including, as it happens, one belonging to a Mr. Fenwick. You are not, I think, going to find this morning ends the way you had hoped." "The girl," Whitmore said suddenly, and there was something almost desperate in it now, the first crack in 15 years of smoothness. "Your Grace, there's a girl in Camden. Fenwick's men, they were told, last night, that you were dead, that her usefulness was. Your Grace, I sent a rider this morning, with instructions to call it off. But if he doesn't reach London in time, Helen Carrow," Edmund said. His voice had gone very cold. "My wife's sister. Yes, Whitmore, we are aware. A rider left for London before dawn as well. Ours. I do hope, for your sake as much as anyone's, that ours was faster than yours." And it was at that exact moment, with Whitmore frozen behind his own former desk, with 6 men from the village filing quietly into the stable yard outside, with a magistrate's letter already sealed and on its way, that the study door opened a second time, and Richard Ashworth, having finally finished reading 40 minutes of legal documents aloud to a woman who had needed every single one of those minutes, walked in to find his cousin, his supposedly dead cousin, sitting behind the estate desk, very much alive and looking directly at him. The papers Richard had been carrying slid out of his hands and scattered across the study floor. "You're," Richard said. "You're Edmund. You're alive." Edmund agreed pleasantly. "I do apologise for the inconvenience, Richard. I understand you'd already begun making arrangements." For the second time in 2 days, the study door opened, and this time it was Cecilia, breathless from the stairs, who stood in the doorway, looking past her stricken cousin-in-law to her husband, alive, upright, dangerous in a way she had genuinely never seen him before. And behind her, just arriving in the courtyard, the unmistakable sound of horses and a man's voice she did not recognise, calling out for His Grace, the Duke of Hartwell, in the brisk, official tones of a man with a magistrate's warrant in his pocket, and very little patience left for explanations. Mr. Edward Pierce, of Bow Street, had not, in fact, ridden out to Hartwell because of Dr. Vale's letter that morning. That letter had not yet reached him. He had ridden out because 3 weeks earlier, acting on information from an informant inside Fenwick's gaming house regarding a pattern of loans extended to gentlemen of good family, and then leveraged, through threats to their relations, into a steady supply of information about the movements of wealthy men. Information that, twice in the past year, had preceded accidents remarkably convenient to certain interested parties. Mr. Pierce had quietly begun watching Mr. Fenwick's establishment and had, the previous evening, intercepted a rider, leaving it carrying a letter addressed to a Mr. J. Whitmore of Hartwell, Surrey. He had read that letter. He had not liked it. And he had ridden through the night to Hartwell with 4 men, arriving in the courtyard at almost exactly the moment Edmund Ashworth, presumed dead for less than 48 hours, was explaining to his cousin precisely how thoroughly that cousin's plans had failed. What followed took most of the day, and involved a great many people, and would, in the weeks that followed, involve a great many more. Solicitors, magistrates, a formal inquiry into the carriage accident that produced, among the wreckage, a wheel whose axle had been very deliberately weakened in a manner that an experienced wheelwright described to the court as not the work of an amateur, and not the work of an accident, my lord, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and precisely how long it would take to fail. James Whitmore, faced with the ledger, the letter, and the testimony of the rider Mr. Pierce's men had intercepted, a rider who, given the choice between hanging alongside his employer or testifying against him, made his choice with admirable speed, told Mr. Pierce everything, in considerable and self-pitying detail, within the hour. Richard Ashworth, for his part, attempted first to claim ignorance, then to claim it had all been Whitmore's doing entirely. Then, when confronted with 3 separate letters in his own hand to Mr. Fenwick regarding arrangements, fell into a silence from which he did not fully emerge for the rest of the day. And in London, a rider from Hartwell, Tom, the groundsman, who had ridden through the night and changed horses twice along the way, reached a small lodging-house in Camden barely 40 minutes before 2 of Fenwick's men arrived at the same address, with considerably less friendly intentions, and found, instead of a frightened young woman alone and unprotected, a household already alerted, doors already locked, and, within the hour, 4 of Mr. Pierce's colleagues, summoned by a second letter Tom had carried for exactly this contingency, waiting for them. Helen Carrow and, for what it was worth, her husband Jeff, who returned from wherever he had been hiding, just in time to discover that his debts, his disappearance, and very nearly his wife's safety had all been the consequence of choices considerably larger and uglier than he had ever understood, was safe by that evening. A rider reached Hartwell with the news just as the sun was setting, and it was Cecilia who received it, standing in the same entrance hall where, 2 nights before, she had fallen to her knees, believing her husband dead. This time, when she received the news, she did not fall. She simply stood very still, for a long moment, with the letter in her hand, and then turned and found Edmund, exhausted, bandaged, having spent the entire day on his feet against every instruction Dr. Vale had given him, standing a few feet away watching her. "She's safe," Cecilia said. "Helen's safe." "I know," Edmund said. "Tom's rider passed mine on the road this morning. I had word an hour ago. I didn't. He stopped. I wanted you to hear it properly, from the letter. Not from me, second-hand, like everything else this week." Cecilia looked at him for a long moment. "You let me hear it from a letter," she said slowly, "because you wanted me to have the moment, not yourself." "Yes," Edmund said, and something in Cecilia's face, something that had been held very tightly all day, through the magistrate's questions and Richard's collapse and Whitmore's arrest and the slow, exhausting unraveling of months of conspiracy, finally, quietly gave way. Not into grief this time, into something that looked, to anyone watching, very much like relief, and underneath the relief, something else. Something neither of them had words for yet, but which both of them, for the first time, were no longer pretending not to feel. But relief, as both of them were about to discover, is not the same thing as resolution. And there was still one conversation neither of them had finished. The one that had begun 2 nights ago in a narrow servant's bed and had been interrupted by everything that came after. "Edmund, what exactly were you planning to do with that?" The question still hung between them. And tonight, with the house finally quiet, with Whitmore and Richard gone, with Helen safe and the magistrate's men departed, tonight there would be nothing left to interrupt it. They sat, that night, not in the master bedroom, and not in the small dressing room, but in the yellow sitting room. Cecilia's room, The one with the faded wallpaper that Edmund had told the housekeeper years ago to replace, and which, he now suspected, Mrs. Pratt had quietly and deliberately never gotten around to, because some part of the household had always understood, even if Edmund himself had not, that this room was the one place in Hartwell that belonged entirely to its Duchess. "I've been thinking about your question," Edmund said, "what I was planning to do with it. The truth, Cecilia, is that I don't know that I was planning anything at all. I think—" He paused, choosing the words with the same care he had once, reserved only for contracts and negotiations, and finding, now, that the care felt different, less like strategy, more like honesty, trying to find its shape. "I think I had spent so many years not planning for anything that involved letting someone matter to me, that when it happened, when I heard you, through that wall, I didn't have a plan ready. For the first time in my life, I think I simply felt something before I had decided what to do about it." "And what did you feel?" Cecilia asked. "Afraid," Edmund said. The word came out rough. "Not of Whitmore, not of Richard, or the conspiracy, or any of it, though God knows that was frightening enough. I was afraid because I realized, lying there, that I had spent 3 years constructing a marriage specifically designed so that I would never have to feel what I was feeling in that moment. And it hadn't worked. It had never worked. You had been there the entire time, loving me anyway. And all my careful distance had done was make certain that when I finally understood that, it arrived with the worst possible timing, in the worst possible way, and I had absolutely no idea what to say to you, or how, or whether I even had the right to say anything at all, given everything I'd failed to say for 3 years already. So you said nothing," Cecilia said, "for an entire day. Yes, even when Larry was caught and you had no choice. Even then, Edmund, you led with the conspiracy. With Whitmore, with the ledgers, with all of it. You told me everything about everyone else in this house before you told me anything at all. About what hearing that letter, what hearing me actually did to you." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "I did, I think." He exhaled slowly. "I think it was easier. The conspiracy was a problem I knew how to solve. Ledgers, evidence, magic abstracts. I have spent my entire adult life solving problems exactly like that. But you, Cecilia, what I felt, hearing you that night, I did not know how to solve that. I'm not sure it's the kind of thing that gets solved at all. And so I did what I have always done with things I don't know how to solve. I put it last. I told myself there would be time for it later, once the urgent things were handled. There is always going to be something urgent, Edmund, Cecilia said, and her voice, though quiet, carried real weight. That has been true every day of our marriage. The estate, the tenants, the leases, the London business. There has always been something more urgent than the conversation we actually needed to have. And I let that happen too, for 3 years. I told myself it was respect, that I was giving you space, that pressing you would only push you further away. We have both, I think, spent 3 years being so careful with each other that we built an entire marriage out of things neither of us was willing to say first. Then let me say it first now, Edmund said, properly, not through a wall, and not because I have no other choice left. He stood slowly, carefully, his ribs still aching, and crossed the small space between them, and knelt, with some difficulty, in front of where Cecilia sat, so that he was looking up at her rather than down, which felt, to both of them, like the only way this could possibly be said. Cecilia, Edmund said, I have spent 3 years telling myself that I married you for an alliance, and that anything beyond correctness and respect was a risk I could not afford. I was wrong. I think, somewhere in the last 3 years, without ever once admitting it to myself, I fell in love with my own wife. And I was so afraid of what that meant, of what it would cost if I ever lost you the way I lost my mother, that I made absolutely certain you never had any reason to believe it was true, because as long as you didn't know, I told myself it couldn't be taken from me, which was, I now understand, the single most foolish piece of reasoning I have ever constructed in a lifetime spent constructing reasoning for a living. His voice caught, and he did not try to hide it. I heard you say it first, Cecilia, through a wall, in the middle of the worst night either of us has ever lived through. And I have thought, every hour since, about how unforgivable it is that the truest thing either of us has said in 3 years of marriage had to happen like that, and how I am never, for the rest of my life, going to let that be the only time it gets said. Cecilia's eyes were bright with tears, but she did not look away, and she did not yet reach for him. I am still angry with you, she said softly. I want you to know that. What you let me believe, for that night. Even understanding why, even understanding everything you've just said. I am still angry about it, Edmund, and I think I am allowed to be both things at once. Angry, and her voice wavered, and so glad, so unbearably glad that you're here, that I can hardly breathe with it. You're allowed, Edmund said. Both things, for as long as you need. I don't want a marriage built on us never asking each other for anything again, Cecilia said. I don't want careful, Edmund. I have had 3 years of careful, and it nearly cost us everything. Both of us, in different ways, the same fear, dressed up differently. She searched for the word. I wanted she'd, where the urgent thing, sometimes, is us. Where it doesn't have to wait for a crisis to become the most important conversation in the house. Then that is what I want too, Edmund said, and I am asking you to hold me to it. Because I suspect, Cecilia, that old habits do not vanish simply because a man has had a very dramatic week. I will need reminding, possibly often, and Cecilia, despite everything, despite the anger that was real, and would take longer than one night to fully settle, found, to her own surprise, that she was laughing, softly, through the tears, and reached out, finally, and took her husband's face in both her hands. Then I will remind you, she said, often. Starting now, Edmund, say it again. Properly, not through a wall. I love you, Edmund said. I love you, Cecilia. I should have said it years ago, and I am saying it now. And I intend to keep saying it, badly and often, and at entirely inconvenient moments, for the rest of however long you'll have me. That, Cecilia said, is considerably better than a wall. Outside the windows of the yellow sitting room, the rain that had begun the night of the accident had finally, after 3 days, stopped, and somewhere below, in the servants' hall, Mrs. Pratt was overheard, that evening, instructing the staff that the black crepe could come down from the knocker in the morning, because, as she put it, with the particular dry satisfaction of a woman who had run this household for 20 years and had seen a great many things, His Grace, it appears, has had a remarkable recovery. Quite the most remarkable I've ever witnessed, in fact. I shouldn't be at all surprised if there's a great deal more recovering still to be done. Hartwell Manor, on a bright morning in early autumn, looked very much as it always had. The same grey stone, the same long gallery, the same yellow sitting room, its wallpaper still faded, though Cecilia had recently mentioned, almost idly, that she rather thought it was time for something new, and Edmund had, without being asked twice, sent for sample books from London that very week. The estate itself looked rather different. James Whitmore had been tried and convicted of fraud and conspiracy, and was, by the autumn, serving a sentence that would keep him from troubling anyone for a very long time. Richard Ashworth spared the gallows only because the evidence against him, though damning, fell short of proving he had known the carriage would be tampered with, rather than merely benefiting from a debt scheme, had nonetheless been quietly, thoroughly, and permanently removed from any connection to the Hartwell estate, and had taken himself off to relations in the north of England, where, it was reported, he had developed a sudden and apparently sincere interest in a quieter sort of life. A new steward had been appointed, a sensible, careful man named James Holloway, recommended by Mr. Pierce himself, whose first act in the role had been to sit down with Edmund and Cecilia together, at Cecilia's insistence, and review the estate's accounts from the beginning. The Hendersons, whose rent had been deferred the night of the accident, had not only kept their cottage but had been among the first families to benefit from a new estate policy. Cecilia's idea, adopted without hesitation by Edmund, establishing a small fund drawn from the estate's own reserves to assist tenant families through hardship, administered jointly by the steward and a tenants' committee that met for the first time in Hartwell's history, with the Duke and Duchess present and listening rather than simply presiding. Helen and Jeff Carow had moved, with quiet but firm encouragement from Cecilia and considerably less quiet encouragement from Edmund, to a small but respectable property on the Hartwell estate itself, close enough for visits, far enough for independence, where Jeff, to everyone's mild astonishment, had taken to managing the local mill's accounts with what the mill owner described as genuinely surprising competence for a man who once nearly gambled away his own wedding ring. And every evening, without exception, a habit that had begun almost shyly in the first week after everything had happened and had simply never stopped. Edmund and Cecilia took tea together in the yellow sitting room and talked. Not about the estate necessarily, though sometimes that too. About the day, about nothing in particular, about the things that, for 3 years, had gone unsaid simply because neither of them had ever made the time, and which now, somehow, took no time at all. "You're thinking about something," Cecilia said, one such evening, watching her husband stare into the fire with the particular stillness she had learned over 6 months meant his mind had wandered somewhere it needed company. "I was thinking," Edmund said, "about how close I came to never knowing any of this. If the wheel had failed 2 inches to the right, instead of where it did, I would have died, Cecilia, genuinely died, having never once told you, and never once heard you say it either, except in a letter to your sister that I'd never have read. 3 years, and I came within 2 inches of leaving this world having gotten everything about it wrong." "But you didn't," Cecilia said simply. She reached across and took his hand. An ordinary gesture now, one of dozens they exchanged every day without thought, that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable for either of them. "You got a second chance most people never get, Edmund. Not many people get to hear, while they're still alive, everything that might otherwise only ever be said over their grave. The question was never whether you'd be given that. It was only ever what you'd do with it, once you had it." Edmund turned his hand to hold hers properly. "I intend," he said, "to spend the rest of my life making sure nobody in this house ever again has to. Wait for a funeral to learn the truth about how much they were loved. Starting with my wife. Daily, if necessary. Daily," Cecilia agreed, smiling, "is acceptable. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from realizing, too late, you believe, everything you never said to them while they could still hear it." Cecilia Ashworth lived through that grief for exactly 1 night, and it broke something open in her that, 3 years of careful, correct marriage never could have. Most of us will never get the strange, terrible gift that Edmund Ashworth got. The chance to hear, while still alive, the words that were meant for our memory. But the lesson underneath this story doesn't require a carriage accident, or a faked death, or a conspiracy involving gambling debts and corrupt stewards. It requires only this, that the people we love should never have to wonder and never have to wait for an ending to find out what they meant to us. Say it now. Say it today if you can. Not because tragedy is coming, but because there is no good reason, ever, for love to be the thing we save for later. Before we go, I want to say something to whoever is listening to this right now. If this story reminded you of someone, a person you have been meaning to call, a conversation you have been carrying around because you were not sure it was the right time, I hope, gently, that tonight was the nudge you needed. There is rarely a perfect moment. There is only the one we decide to make. If Edmund and Cecilia kept you here tonight, if Cecilia's letter to her sister hit you the way it always hits me when I read it back, then please, before you go, leave us a like and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are tonight, and if you feel moved to, tell me about the person this story made you think of. Those comments are the reason I keep telling these stories. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with Edmund and Cecilia, and with me. These stories exist because you choose to listen. Until the next one, take care of yourselves, and take care of the people. Take who are still here to hear you say it.